and we'll just wait a couple of minutes for everyone to join. Hi, everyone that's joining. We'll probably wait till about 32, 33, and then I'll get started just to give everyone a chance to join. Fantastic. So I think I'll get started. Welcome, everyone. So this webinar is about understanding accessibility evaluations and testing results. My name's Alice Taylor, and I'm an accessibility and usability consultant at AbilityNet. So we're going to start with a bit of quick housekeeping. There should be, there are live captions available during the event, which can be toggled on and off. The slides, a transcript and the recording will be made available after the event. Please use the Q&A window for questions and the chat window for any general conversation. And there will also be a feedback form as well after the event. So just a little bit about AbilityNet for those of you that might not have heard of us before. We are a technology charity that provides a range of free and expert paid for products, services and resources. And our vision is a digital world that is accessible to all. So products and services that we do are digital consultancy, digital accessibility consultancy, auditing and training, as well as diverse user testing. And we've recently run an event called TechShare Pro that was on last week as well. And we do run Tech for Good awards as well. So today's session is about understanding accessibility evaluations and testing results. So we're going to be thinking about how results can be interpreted and what things to think about when we get our websites tested, particularly how results are communicated and prioritized. So this content should be relevant if you're doing the testing yourself or if you have a third party doing the testing for you. So things we're going to look at are we're going to learn about how accessibility issues should be reported. So thinking about it from compliance with WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But we'll also be thinking more holistically about what you need to get out of the accessibility audit and important things to consider when communicating an issue. We'll also be understanding the factors that can influence prioritizing accessibility issues. So thinking about what's most important. Is it the size of the audience? Is it the number of instances? And how that will affect prioritizing those issues. And also discover how automated accessibility checkers report issues. So we'll be looking at the ACTS checker today for single pages and also looking at some site scanners. And we'll review some techniques for embedding accessibility in your organization. So this is looking beyond auditing. We're looking at how we can use that audit report to help change processes and embed it within your organization. And of course, there's going to be plenty of opportunities to ask questions. While I'm talking as well, please feel free to pop any questions in the Q&A panel, and we will be taking pauses throughout to answer any questions. So we're going to start with a poll. So I'm going to launch the poll in a second. Depending on how you've accessed this webinar, it might not appear on your screen. If it doesn't, just pop your answer in the chat. But I'll launch the poll now. So the poll's now been launched. The question is, have you commissioned or undertaken an accessibility audit on a current product? And the options are commissioned an audit from a third party, undertaken an audit internally, not had an audit but have seen an audit report, not commissioned or undertaken an audit or seen an audit report. So this poll is just for me to get a general idea of your experience of auditing and just to see who we have on the webinar today. So I'll just give you a few more seconds. Just a few more seconds for those of you that haven't answered. And I'll end the poll now. Fantastic. So 30% of you have commissioned an audit from a third party. 14% of you have undertaken an audit internally. 10% of you have not had an audit but have seen an audit report. And 46% of you have not commissioned or undertaken an audit or seen an audit report. Fantastic. So it looks like we've got a really good range. It looks like the majority of people on the webinar today have not commissioned or undertaken an audit or seen an audit report. So hopefully for those that haven't seen one, this webinar will be useful to look at how things to look out for. And for those of you that have seen one or have undertaken one, this should hopefully also give you some information around what to look for in those reports. And then we're going to have another poll as well. So this is for those of you that have seen an audit report. So this question is, if you've seen an audit report, what was your experience when reading it? So I'll just launch this question. So the question is, if you've seen an audit report, what was your experience reading it? The options are easy to understand, mostly easy to understand, quite difficult to understand, and very difficult to understand. So this again, this poll is for those of you who have seen a report. What was your experience when you were reading it? I'll just give you a few more seconds. Okay, I'll end the poll now. So we have quite a range here. So 7% said it was easy to understand. 63% said mostly easy to understand. 26% said quite difficult to understand, and 4% said very difficult to understand. So this is really, really encouraging that 63% of you said mostly easy to understand. That's brilliant. It is a shame that not more of you found them easy to understand, but the reason why you might have found them quite difficult or very difficult to understand could be because some issues can be very technical and they could be very relevant to developers, but depending on what your job role is, they may be quite difficult to understand, or they could be issues relevant to designers or content authors. So today, we'll be talking about the importance of writing really clear issues that can be understood by all. So people reading the report don't have to be specialists to be able to understand the report. Thank you everyone for participating in those polls. So we're going to move on and first look at why it's important to understand the accessibility results. So there are several levels to this. At a very basic level, understanding accessibility results can help us gauge compliance. So we might want to understand where we're at with accessibility. Do we pass or fail WCAG? If your organisation's within the public sector, then you may want to know if you pass in order to meet those requirements. Or at But if we're looking beyond compliance, we might want to understand the impact of the accessibility issues and what we can do to fix them. So we might want to think about who are those issues affecting, how serious are those issues, how does it affect that user, and what is the priority of that issue? And we'll be talking more about that today. And also, are there some that are more important to fix than others, and what is the cost of fixing those issues? And then we might also want to build on that further. So we might want to use our results ideally to plan for accessibility improvements. So thinking about the longer term and how can we use the findings of our accessibility report to embed accessibility within our organization. So we might be thinking about what training do we need and who needs it, and how can our systems be improved so that those issues don't occur and that our audit reports come back with less issues. So it's important not to consider an audit report just as a pass or fail exercise. They can be really, really good tools if we understand them, to help build upon them, and we can take actions from it. Just briefly going to look at some different testing approaches. So there are different ways to test for accessibility. We may use automated checkers. Today we'll be looking at ACTS, which you may or may not have heard of. This runs tests on code and produces results. We also need to do manual checks as well, though. So these have to be done alongside automated checks. So automated checks, it's not possible to catch all accessibility issues with just automated checkers. But any checks that have to be manual checks, are any checks that have to be done by a human, because automated checkers can't catch everything. And then we might also want to use the site scanner. So this is a type of automated checker, but it will scan the full site. So in an audit report, you might be using a sample of pages. So you might be taking a representative sample, which gives you a thorough, those pages are audited thoroughly, but a site scanner can give that automated check and catch some of those issues that can be caught with an automated checker across the entire site. But it's important to use a combination of all of them. So we can't just use one of these approaches. And in particular, we can't rely on those automated checks. So how do we report our results? So when it comes to the template for reporting them, there isn't a compulsory template you need to use, but there is a recommended template you can use. And this link will be available in the slides afterwards. Which is for WCAG accessibility evaluation reports. And this can give you kind of things that you can expect to see in a report and what you can expect it to contain. So firstly, a summary. This should contain an overview of findings and also indicate the severity of the issues. So this summary can be really useful because it can be something you might want to give to senior management, for example. Because it will help show you the bottom line of kind of where you're at with accessibility and detail what's been found, as well as who does it impact. And then it should also contain a scope of the review. So this should detail what pages were tested and when, and also any standards that were used. So this should be really clear to identify exactly what's been tested and to what standard. And then the review process. So this is really important to be clear about what browsers or assistive technologies were used in the report. So depending on what browser you use or what assistive technology you're using, you could get slightly different results. So it's important to describe what's been used so that it's being replicated. And this is really important because a problem might occur on one browser with a certain assistive technology, but it might not occur on another. So for the person fixing that issue, it's really important that they know how to replicate it in order to know that it has been fixed. And also, we want to have a results and recommended actions within our template. So this should often this is reported by WC success criteria, and also additional issues may be reported. So an example of an additional issue is something that doesn't necessarily strictly fail WCAG, but the person doing the report has noted it as something that you might want to consider improving. So An example of this could be the browser indicator. If you rely on just the default browser indicator, which is supplied by Chrome, Firefox, whichever browser you're using, this is exempt from requirements, so this would pass. However, if you were to provide a custom browser indicator, so focus indicator, sorry, this can be really beneficial for your users because it can be a lot more high contrast. It can make it a lot clearer where the focus is, as the default ones may not be as clear. So this can be really beneficial. So an additional issue may be raised to highlight that and to inform you of the requirements for that custom focus indicator, because it would need to meet color contrast requirements. And finally, you'd also want to have an appendices as well. So this would contain any additional information about the process, any useful resources, maybe who did the report and what process was followed. And you also want to make sure that you have an agreed approach. So even if you have your template in place, some other things you want to consider and discuss before commissioning an audit are these things to making sure that approach is agreed. So firstly, what pages have been tested? So you want to decide what part of your site is going to be tested. As mentioned earlier, in an audit, you generally have a representative sample of your site. So which pages do those include and are they detailed? And also thinking about the readiness of your project. So is it in the prototype stage and is it ready to be tested? In this case, how much of the reports, how deep do you want the testing to go at this stage if it's just a prototype? And you also want to think about the standards or guidelines to use in testing. So usually now this is often WCAG 2.1 AA, but you might have a reason why you want to test for WCAG 2.0, for example. Or you might want to test for certain WCAG AAA criteria. So there might be certain ones that are relevant to your audience that may be beneficial that you might want to add as ones that you want to consider. There's also EN 301549. So the public sector bodies regulation standard does cite this. And for websites, it's basically the same as WCAG 2.1 AA, but there are some additional requirements for documents and applications. So if you are required to meet the public sector body regulations, do have a look at that standard. And you might also want to do other types of testing. So this could be design or prototype reviews. So you might not be at the stage where you have a built product. You might be at the stage where you just have your designs and a prototype, in which case you could do a review of the colors and things like that can be tested at the design stage. And you also want to think about what platforms, browsers and assistive technologies to use in your review. So is it a desktop only review? Does it include an app or does it have a responsive view, which the user can also view on mobile? And also think about those browser and screen reader combinations. So when you're testing, make sure that you have that set. So if you're using one browser, make sure that you're also using the screen reader which works well with it. So for example, Chrome works best with JAWS and NVDA 5 and IE, while NVDA may be better with Firefox or Chrome, for example, and have this defined before you start. And also think about how it's reported. So as we mentioned earlier, if it's a WCAG audit, you'd usually report things under the criteria. So that could be how it's structured. But you could do a different approach if it's not WCAG. So you could report it page by page, for example. And we also want to think about how we want to prioritize the issues. So this is really important to kind of understand the impact of those issues. One of the most common ways in accessibility testing is to look at the impact on the user and prioritize it that way. And this is what we use at AbilityNet. Different accessibility consultants have different scales. So some might have a 5-point scale, but we have a 3-point scale. So if we look at the different levels, something that is considered high priority is considered to be something that a user or a certain user group can't use. So this would mean that specific user groups are completely excluded. An example of this could be a button that you might be able to click on using a mouse. But if you try and activate that same button with a keyboard, it may not be possible, in which case that would be a high priority issue because keyboard users would be completely excluded from that. Something that's medium priority could cause certain user groups problems, but it's not preventing them from using the site. So they may experience, it wouldn't be a complete blocker, but it would still cause them problems. An example could be the focus order. So when you're tabbing through the page, you would expect to go from left to right across the page through the content. However, if this focus order wasn't logical and the focus was jumping around the page, the user could still access all those links, but it may be problematic and confusing for them. So that would be considered a medium priority. And finally, low priority. So this could be something that can be considered as causing an annoyance. So it might be something that may slow down the user, but it's not causing a blocker and it's not preventing them from accessing anything. However, minor issues can be cumulative and lead to significant usability and accessibility barriers. So for example, if there is lots of a small issue, it could be more problematic than something that is just a single instance. So an example of this could be unnecessary announcements for an assistive technology. So if there was additional text next to a link that wasn't needed, for example, that was just one link, then we could consider that as audio clutter. And it may be problematic, but only slightly annoying. However, if every single link on the page and there was lots and lots of extra text that didn't need to be there, that could be more problematic because it could be preventing the user from accessing the content. So we might want to raise the priority of that. Another way of thinking about priority levels is numbers affected. So this, in this way of measuring priority, we could think about what is the size of the audience that may experience difficulties due to this issue. And also, does the issue affect multiple user groups, and how are the audience of your website specifically affected? So something like a keyboard issue, we would tend to consider this to be high priority as they affect people from a range of different user groups. So for example, someone who might have a physical disability may struggle to use a mouse. They would be affected by a keyboard issue, but also a screen reader user who was unable to use a mouse and relied on the keyboard to navigate. Any assistive technology that uses a keyboard interface would be affected by keyboard issues. So this could be considered high priority. And then thinking about the audience of your website specifically, if you know, for example, that you have a high number of older users, for example, you may want to have low vision issues as a high priority. But there may also be some AAA issues that you might want to add. So for example, you might want to make touch sizes of buttons and links larger so that they're easier to touch and easier to activate. And you may also want to prioritize issues with captions as well. So older users may have problems with hearing, in which case captions may be more important and therefore higher priority for you if you knew that you had a high number of older users on your site. And we might also want to measure priority based on number of instances. So this might be more traditional in terms of traditional software development, thinking about those numbers of incidences, sorry. So for example, something might be considered a high priority issue if it was a site-wide issue. So maybe you would have an issue in your navigation, for example, where this component appears on every page and the user uses the navigation to navigate through the site. Fixing that issue would then fix it in all those places and would then mean that site-wide that was an improvement, so that might be considered higher priority. And then something that was maybe a reusable component, this might be considered a medium priority, for example. So generally we do recommend designing and developing with reusable components. So this could be, for example, a video player component, which anytime a video player is used, this component is used. And this can be helpful rather than having different components across the site. And by fixing the issues with a reusable component, you then fix the issues across all of those, every instance of that issue. And then you might also have individual page issues. So this could be something that only occurs on one page, and therefore may seem like a lower priority. However, again, it's also important to note that it should be case by case. So for example, it might be one instance of an issue where a button cannot be clicked, but that could completely block a certain user group from completing a task, in which case, even though it's only one instance, it should still be considered a higher priority, as that button wouldn't work with a keyboard. And finally, we can think about measuring priority in terms of cost of fix as well. So there are two things to consider with the cost of fix: the complexity and the number of instances. So external accessibility consultants might have different understandings of how complex something is to fix. It might be difficult for them to know in terms of your specific system how difficult something is to fix. So once you have an audit report, it might be best to sit down with your developers once you have it, to get an idea of that complexity, and think about, does an instance occur in just one place, or is it occurring in multiple places? And it may also not have to, there may not be an immediate fix for it. So for example, it might be a third-party system where you might have no control over it. There may be a workaround, but you should discuss with the owner of the content. And also, it's important to avoid retrospective fixes. So the earlier you consider accessibility in the process, the easier it is to fix. So at that point, you haven't committed yourself to certain frameworks. So the earlier you think about it, the better. So before we move on to the next section, I'm just going to stop for a quick Q&A break. If anyone's got any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A section. So we have a question, which is, how often should an audit report be conducted on your site? That is a really good question. So I believe, I think off the top of my head, I think public sector ones, they say you should update your statement once a year, but I would double check that in the official documentation. But generally, once a year could be a good time. I don't think there is a set time that you should have one, but consider based on your particular platform or website. It might be that you are regularly doing fixes. That means that maybe you should have an audit report more regularly, or it might be that you haven't done any changes, in which case it would be less important. Is there a name for the rating scale that you use? Do you mean the high, medium and low, the, I can't remember it myself now. I'll go back to that slide. Impact on users scale. I don't know if there's an official name for it, but in terms of measuring priority, it would be on impact of users. Yes, brilliant. That should have hopefully answered your question. And then we have a comment in the chat, which is, I've used SortSite to scan websites and then also use Wave plugin. They both give different results. Difficult to determine which tool is the most accurate. Have you any thoughts on that? Thank you very much for that, Alice. So This is a really good point. We will be talking more about this in the next section. So I'll leave your question for now, but please feel free to ask any more later if I don't answer it as I talk. So I'll now move on to the next section, which is we're going to look at an example audit. So this audit, I will pop a link in the chat, which is developed by, so this webpage was developed by the Washington State University to train people on accessibility. The page has known accessibility issues. So the link here, there's also a list of the issues which I'd probably ask you not to try not to look at during the session, but definitely have a look at after the session to see what issues there were on the page. But for now, try and focus on just looking at the first link. So I will post a link in the chat now. Mm-hmm. And I can also see there's another question, sorry about that one. So what about Irish sign language videos for public body websites from ISL Act? So that's a good question. That one we can follow up with in the follow-up and see if we can provide an answer for you for that one. So the link should now be in the chat. This website is meant to replicate a university website, but it is relevant to any website. So it does have components which you may be familiar with, and it has some useful things to consider as well. So I'm going to look at testing this from different perspectives. So as I mentioned earlier, the automated tool I will be using today is Axe. But there are other ones. I believe the one that was mentioned in the chat just now was Wave, so you might be familiar with that one. So Axe, you can download it and it will appear in your when you inspect the element. So this is Axe DevTools. Here we can then look at, we can scan the page or we can scan part of the page if you have there's a paid for version and a free version. So the scan all page is one that I'll be using today. And this has loads of different tools. And as I said, there's also other ones such as Wave. So this is one we'll be looking at today. We'll also be using, looking at site scanners as well as manual testing exercises. And we will see how we can report the results on this in an accessibility report and look at some examples of how the issues would look, what they'd look like in an actual report. So we'll start with the automated tools, which was the Axe we were just looking at. It's important to note that they can't find all the issues, as I mentioned before. So this GDS report, again, there's a link on the slide. This found that automated tools could find 40% of issues on the site. So we can't find all the issues. I'll show a demo of this report. So this here, we can see that certain things, we can see that, for example, small text does not have a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1. This was found on roughly half of the different tools used, while other ones, focus not visible, this was not found on the majority of automated checkers. So these are things to consider, and these are things that would also need a manual review. Some things to consider. Issues can be harder to understand due to there can be multiple issues reported for the same problem, so missing alt text. So for example, you might have an image which doesn't have alt text, but you might have, it might be a component where you have lots of that same component across the page, but each individual instance would be reported as not having alternative text. In this case, it can be, there can be 20 issues which are essentially the same one issue, but because there are 20 instances of it, they're all reported. And also you might have multiple tests for a single success criteria. So there are actually few issues that you can completely test with an automated checker. There are some you will need to do further review on as well. So for example, you can test that there is a language attribute on the HTML, but you would need to manually check that it's the correct code that's being used. And issues still need further human review. So some may flag up, but you should also review them to make sure that they're valid issues. But automated checkers can be really useful for helping to catch those issues that can be seen in the code. So as I mentioned, we're going to have a look at the free open source checker Axe. It doesn't have a very visual checker. What it does is it will highlight issues in the code, and I'll run a demo in a moment. And it's aimed at developers and testers. And one of the aims of it is to have as few false positives as possible. You can build it into your continuous integration testing. So this could mean you could help get rid of those accessibility issues before they get to the live site. And you could run those Axe tests alongside other tests. So Axe is, you can have it as a Firefox and Chrome extension, which is what I showed just now. And there's also an Android app, and it's also built into Lighthouse and Microsoft Insights. So I'll also demo those as well. So if we go back to our page, as I showed before, Axe DevTools is located within Inspect Element. And then all I've got to do is scan the whole page, and then this will generate, this will look for all the issues that it finds on the page. So the first one, for example, we have elements must have sufficient color contrast. So what this will do is it will allow me to highlight the issue in the code. So this will show me exactly where the problem is. And it will also show me where it is exactly in the code. So I can see here, it's this link over in the DOM. I'll just zoom in a bit. There we go. And then it will also link to more information. So this can be really helpful to help provide those details as to why this is a failure, and give you information on why it matters, as well as information on additional resources as well. And then another one that's been flagged is the HTML element must have a language attribute. So again, we can highlight this, we can inspect it in the code, we can see the HTML doesn't have a language attribute, and we can see it's provided us the information as well as a solution of how to fix. And the same checks are available on other systems as well. So Lighthouse here, if I generate the brought, this may take a moment. Lighthouse uses Axe, so what it will do is it will bring up the same results. So this one has a slightly different interface. So we can see here the contrast. We have that same contrast issue. It's highlighted the same problem that we saw on Axe. However, this has given us a slightly more visual indication. And then we have that HTML element does not have a lang attribute. That's also here, and it's same information, just in a different format. You can also export it as a report. So this it depends on your workflow of which one you prefer to use. And it also has a score. So this can tell you a rough score of your website. However, take it with a pinch of salt, because there is a really good article that talks about a website that has 100% Lighthouse score. However, it's completely inaccessible. So the score is based on the things it can automatically check. It doesn't look at, it can't look at the manual things. So it shouldn't, don't aim to make this, look at making your website fully accessible rather than aiming to have 100% Lighthouse score. And then the other tool is Accessibility Insights. So this is a bookmark that you can put into Chrome and Edge, I believe. So this, it will give you a range of different options. There are lots of different options under Accessibility Insights, and this will give you this tool. So the same with the automated checks, they've already been run on this page, and I get the same issues. So color contrast here, those same color contrast issues have come up. And then HTML has language attribute, this same HTML issue has also come up again. So we can see that they're all built on Axe, so that's why they have the same reported issues. And then we had the comment about Wave in the chat as well. So Wave is another automated tool that can be used. It is down to preference. This again can give summary and details, but it uses a different system, so it may report different issues. It's just down to which one. It's about consistency. So if you choose to use one over the other, make sure you're using the same one so that you get those same results when you're using it. So there are some benefits. So for something like Lighthouse, for example, it does have different tools in it anyway. So if we look at Lighthouse again, we can see here it has performance, best practices, SEO. So developers may be familiar with this already. So this may be one that could be used as developers may be familiar with it already. But that's just an example of some of the different automated checkers that you can use to test your site. If I go back to the slides. So there's also site scanners as well. So this is automated checkers that you can run across your entire web estate. So they can be good because they can help measure the progress of accessibility efforts. They can help see across your entire web estate those automated issues. But as I mentioned, it doesn't capture all issues, but it can just give you that good overview of your whole website. And you can also produce shareable results, which can help encourage content owners to prioritize accessibility. So you can group the results maybe by the different groups of people that are responsible for them, so that they can own those different areas. But some of the drawbacks of it are they might need a bit of a sense check of the results, and they might also be difficult to interpret. So number of issues can be really overwhelming because there could be, depending on the size of your website, there could be tens of thousands of issues reported. And again, it could be that it's one image that's a reusable component, doesn't have an alt attribute, but that this would be reported as many times as it is, because even though it's one issue, every instance of that issue is reported. And the same with color contrast. If one color has been used, so a link text, link color against the background, this would fail in every instance of this, not just that one time. And also the cost. So they are paid for services, so this can be a drawback, and it can potentially give a false sense of security. So even if no issues are picked up on your automated site scanner check, that doesn't mean there's no accessibility issues. There would still need to be that manual review. So now I'm just going to do a demo of a site scanner, which is Axe Monitor. So again, the reason I'm demoing this one is just because we were looking at Axe earlier. There are different ones available. This is just one that we can use to illustrate what you could expect to see from a automated site scanner. So this one we can see, again, we have the same issues that we looked at: the color, ensure the contrast between the foreground and the background colors meets the requirements. We have the HTML, ensure every HTML document has a language attribute. So those same issues are reported, but the key difference is before we were looking at it on a page by page basis. This time it's looked at the entire site, and it's reported against all the pages. So instead of just reporting it on that one page I was looking at, it was looking at it across the entire site. So this site scanner may be useful for your organization. So before I move on to accessibility reports, I'm just going to have another brief pause for questions. I can see there's a few have come in. In the chat. Oh, so one says, from your experience, which provides the most consistency in terms of reporting and guidance? I'm assuming this is related to the automated checkers. That's a really good question. I think it really depends on your workflow and what works best for you. ACTS can be good because it aims to provide, aims to only have, aims to not have any false positives. So theoretically, any issue in ACTS should be an issue, because while sometimes something might be raised and actually after looking at it, you might see that it's not actually an issue. But then other ones have different benefits. It really depends on what your workflow is like. So another question is, so Wave is an extension on Chrome, but seems to pick up more issues than Site Sort Scanner doesn't pick up. So I think Wave and Site Sort, so Wave's a automated checker within the browser, and Site Sort, I believe, is a site scanner. So those two, I think, are completely different systems from what I know, in which case they may well pick up different things because they're built off different platforms. That could be a reason for that. So I think that's all the questions for now. I'll move on to the next section, but do ask any questions you have as we go along as well. So we're going to look at accessibility reports now and thinking about what we need to include. So first of all, we want to think about this section is very much thinking about what's the issue specifically. So when we have our accessibility reports, what do we want to include about specific issues? So firstly, we want to think about what happened. So we want to detail a description of the exact accessibility problem. So this could be just detailing to the user, for the person reading the report, what is the problem that has been identified. And then we want to think about the impact on the user. So this doesn't need to be technical. It just needs to be information for the person fixing it to know what the problem is and to know what that impact on the users is. And we also want to detail where it happens. So we want to think about what page did it happen on, and where on that page did it happen, and also what platform, device, browser, or input method was affected. So for example, was it only a keyboard only issue? Did it happen was it a screen reader problem? So this is important information to help help the person who's replicating it know that information as well. And also it needs to be clear how to replicate that issue. So this is really important for them to know how to fix that issue. They need to be able to replicate it in the first place. And we also want to have recommendations on how to fix it. So this can be a basic description. Code examples are really useful, but also it depends on your audience. So if it's an issue for developers, then code examples can be really, really beneficial. And also additional resources can be good. So it could be a problem where you can provide a best practice example, for example, but it depends on the issue. So the guidelines themselves, the WCAG guidelines, can be quite technical, and this example shows the keyboard requirement. So this says that all functionality of the content is operable through a keyboard interface without requiring specific timings for individual keystrokes, except where the underlying function requires input that depends on the path of the user's movement and not just the endpoints. So what the success criteria requires is that the user can tab through the page and all the parts are operable. So some things we might, that it might pass this criteria, it might fail this criteria, or it might also be not applicable. So an example of where this might be not applicable could be, so for keyboard, it can be quite rare. There are very few pages where this is not applicable, but something like the captioning and audio description requirements, these would not be applicable if there was no video on the page, for example, because there'd be no video that would need captioning or audio description. So we're now just going to have a quick activity. So what I'd like you to do is have a look at the Accessible University website, which I popped a link to in the chat earlier. I'll repost it again. And what I'd like you to do is have a look at this website and focus on just the top part of the page. And what I'd like to do is try and use the top part of the page with a keyboard. And any issues that you find, just pop them in the chat. So I'll just give you a minute or two to do that. Just open it up in your browser and using just your keyboard, try and tab around the page, just the top half, and any issues you find, pop them in the chat. Oh, so oh yeah, we've got a few comments in the chat. So there's no focus indicators at all. Yeah, fantastic spot. The order doesn't seem correct either. Good spot. Can't tab to the menu. Link's not highlighted as I tab through. Hard to see what's being focused. I can't see what's focused on. I've got the site open in Edge, trying to tab, but physically can't. Yeah, these are all fantastic things to spot. And it looks like we've got a quite a similar theme of can't see the visible focus indicator. So there's no visible focus indicator on the page. This makes it harder to spot different issues. So it might be something that could be, this can make it really difficult to spot other keyboard issues if there's no focus indicator. And we've got color contrast as well. Yep, that's a really good spot as well. Yeah, we can see here, if I try and tab on the page, it's not at all clear where I am. There's no focus indicator to know where I am on the page. So there are tools in this instance to help so that you can actually find the other keyboard issues. There's one called Force Focus, which is a bookmarklet. And what this will do is it will just provide a forced focus. So it'll overwrite the styles and give me that focus indicator. So here I can see I can focus on the menu items in the header and then move down, and then I can actually see where I am. But with these menu items, if I hover over them with a mouse, I can see the submenu. However, when I'm tabbing, there's actually no way for me to access those subheadings. So even though I'm pressing enter, I can't, using a keyboard, I'm not able to get that same functionality that I would get with a mouse. So these are all things these are things that we'd want to raise issues for in our audit reports. So looking at this issue with the mouse hover, we're just now going to look at how we might go about reporting that specific issue. So this is one of my colleagues has written these issues up from the site in the style of how we might write them up. And here we are reporting about the fact that the navigation menu bar is not accessible when using a keyboard. So things we have as part of the issues are we have the criteria it fails under, so 2.1.1 keyboard. We have a reference number, so WCAG 002, it can be any reference ID. And then we have a summary of what the issue is. So navigation menu bar is not accessible using keyboard, and we have a priority, so high priority. And then it's made clear that the pages affected are pages 1. And then we go on to describe what the issue is. So on the top of the page, there is a drop-down menu. When hovering over each item on the menu bar using a mouse, it expands, showing the respective submenu with the list of pages which can be accessed on click. Using a keyboard, although the focus indicator of the menu bar items is not visible, they are focusable. However, when receiving focus, it is not possible to activate them using keyboard only or a screen reader. This issue affects all keyboard users who cannot access other pages on the website using the navigation menu bar. So here we've described what the issue is, and we've also detailed what the impact is on the user. So this is made it clear that it's affecting keyboard only and screen reader users. And it is important to test keyboard with and without a screen reader because you may get different results. And we also have some screenshots as well So this can show where exactly it is on the page and also show the affected code, which can be really helpful when you come to recheck that issue to see if it's fixed. And then we also have a recommendation as well. So this recommendation, it may be difficult to provide. Sometimes it may be difficult to provide an exact recommendation. So if you are not familiar with how it's built, for example, or if it's an external third party who does the report, they may not know how something's been made. But what you can do is you can always describe the best practice, expected behavior, and provide resource examples. So here we've said what we're expecting, which is ensure the navigation menu bar is accessible to keyboard users. Both the navigation menu bar and submenus must be navigable as expected and correctly announced when using a screen reader. And then we've provided some resources. So this is what we would expect it to work like, and some resources of what the developer could use to fix that problem. And then this is another example of an issue. So this is one of the ones that we saw when we were running the ACTS checker. So here the requirement is that the default human language of each web page can be programmatically determined. And this would fail under 3.1.1 language of page. So again, we have the reference and we have the summary of the issue, which is the language of the page is not specified. And we've given it a priority level of medium because it isn't a complete blocker. A screen reader may mispronounce, but it doesn't prevent them from accessing the page, but it does affect all pages. And then we've got a description of what the problem is, and we've detailed what the impact is on the user. And then for this one, we've just provided a very simple recommendation. So exactly detailing what they need to add to that header element. So we provided that code and said very simple recommendation detailing what is needed. And then there are issues that we that do need to be found through manual review. So for this, I'd like you to go back to the website again, and I'd like you to have a look at these two paragraphs. So I'll go to the web page. The two paragraphs are found just if you scroll down the page slightly, we've got these two paragraphs here. And what I'd like you to look at is, can you identify any issues with those two paragraphs? And again, if you just pop anything you spot in the chat, are there any issues that we'd want to report as part of an audit report in that those two paragraphs? Just as you're doing that, I can see there's a question that's come up. Many people access information through their phones. Is this an issue for WCAG and accessibility? That's a really good point. Yes, so if it was an app, for example, that would need to be accessible. And if you have a website that you view in responsive mode, for example, if you load up any website and you view it on your phone, it does need to meet the requirements on mobile as well. So yes, mobile would need to meet accessibility requirements as well. So we've got some suggestions of problems that we might want to raise. Headings are not headings. Yep. So if we inspect these, we can see that it's a div, but it's been styled to look like a heading. So we have CSS has been used, but it's not semantically a heading. Links are not descriptive. Yep. So we have, that's an interesting issue that we'll come back to, which says click here, click here. That's a really good point. Size of text. That's an interesting one. So with the size of text, it wouldn't actually fail. There is no minimum font size requirement under WCAG. The requirement is that it can be scaled. So the requirement is that you can zoom in and that the text enlarges when you customize your text size. There is no minimum font size requirement as a standard. Spacing, H tags not being used, click here, not best practice. Yeah, those are all interesting ones, and links are not descriptive. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone. So if we go back to the slides. So yeah, you've seems like you spotted a number of issues with these two paragraphs that we would want to report as part of an audit report. And now we're going to look through some of these and think about how we would go about reporting them and what priority we would give those issues. So one that we would look at, which I don't think anyone popped in the chat, but I'll quickly demo, is we looked at the language of the page. So it's important that on the HTML attribute, we have the language of the page set. However, there's also a requirement of language of parts. So this is making sure that if you have any language which is not the default site language, that you also have that specified. So here we have Spanish text. However, there is no language attribute on this text telling the assistive technology that this is Spanish. So we would need to make sure that we have a language attribute on this telling the user, telling assistive technologies that this is actually a different language. So if we look at that issue and think about how we'd want to report it, on the landing page, there's a paragraph in Spanish. Although the language of the page is not specified, which we talked about earlier, screen readers assume the page is in the default language. A screen reader with a default language of English will announce the Spanish text with English pronunciation, which may confuse screen reader users. And then we have that a screenshot to show what we are referring to. So for this one, I haven't set a priority on it. So I'm going to launch a poll and give you a chance to give your opinion on what you think the priority of this issue should be. So what priority level would do you think we should give this issue? If I launch the poll, what priority do you think this issue should be? High, medium, or low? Let's give you a few moments to answer that one. So again, what priority do you think this issue should be? High, medium, or low? So I think if I end the poll in a moment. So 19% of you said high, 61% of you said medium, and 19% of you said low. So yeah, I think we would probably raise this as a medium priority by default, as it's not a complete blocker. It would still be read out, but it would be mispronounced. So it's problematic for screen reader users, but it wouldn't stop people from getting to the content. There could be an argument for it being high or low, depending on the context. So for example, if it was a website about teaching Spanish, for example, then this could be considered a higher priority than in the context that we have it, where it's a paragraph and it's not the main content on the site. So we can also provide a recommendation. So we want to ensure that all text not written in the page's main language has a language attribute specified. So what we'd want to do is add a language attribute to those particular elements to help define that is which language that is in. And there's a resource here which has a non-exhaustive list of 2-letter language codes. So depending on the language, there is a different code for it that needs to be specified in order for that to be correctly announced. And then another problem that would be spotted in that paragraph is that the use of color. So the requirement for this is that color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. So the issue that was spotted here is that links are identified by color alone. So the click here links under can you spot the barriers are visually identified by color alone, while the paragraph text is black. These links have a gray tone. So if I go back to the website for this one, here we have these click here links. When you hover over them, you do have an underline. However, if for this to pass the criteria, it would also need to have a 3:1 contrast ratio against the surrounding text. So this fails because of the color contrast. And ideally, it would be best for this to have an underline by default. So again, what priority should this be? I'll launch another poll. What priority do we think this issue should be? Do we think it should be high, medium, or low? And this issue could occur at a template or site-wide level as it affects all links. And just as you're answering that, I can see there's a question about the links of, is there another visual treatment you can give besides an underline for a link to pass? Yes, there is. So as I just mentioned, the best by default, the default underline before you hover over it is preferred. So underline by default is best. However, if you have that color contrast of 3:1, you could have the background color change, for example, or for there to be an outline, or for the text to be bold. But in this instance, the underline alone is not enough. It does need to have that color contrast requirement. So looks like nearly everyone's answered the poll. I'll end the poll. So for this one, 56% of you said you'd make it high priority, 39% of you said medium, and 6% said low. So personally, I think for this one, I'd probably go for medium, as it's not a complete blocker. However, the frequency of the issues may make it a higher priority. So I can see why a lot of you said high when you saw the information about it's likely to occur at a template or site-wide level. So this could be a reason for high priority. And again, we talked about earlier about thinking about your website and your audience. So for example, if you knew that you had a lot of older users that visited your website, then making sure that this could be considered a higher priority than as it's a low, it would affect low vision users. I could just see a question in chat, which is, what is the 3:1 ratio you mentioned? I've read about this before. Is there software to calculate the 3:1 ratio? And then this is a good option to check. Thank you very much, James. Yes, pops a resource in the chat for checking Contrast Checker. So to answer your question about what is the 3:1 ratio you mentioned, so this is the color contrast requirement that's required. So for regular text, the requirement is 4.5:1 against the background, but for in the example that we're looking at here, it's 3:1 against the surrounding text. But you can check the contrast with a resource like that. So I can also see another comments come in that thought read more, click here links were problematic. Where appropriate, reword the link text so that it's more descriptive of its destination when read out of context. Remove any extraneous text such as click here. Thanks very much for that, Pete. So that actually leads us on to our next issue that we're going to talk about, which is that the links have no descriptive text. So this is an interesting one, and a lot of you picked up on this one, so that's really great. And so the links under can you spot the barriers all have the same text, click here, which is not descriptive of their purpose. However, this actually doesn't strictly fail WCAG 2.4.4 link purpose in context, as the links are explained in the context of the surrounding paragraph. So if we go back to our example, we can see here, the click here is actually a link within a paragraph of text. So the context, the click here context is in that surrounding text. But this would we could still raise this as an additional issue, as we may want to report things that aren't strictly WCAG failures. But this would also fail WCAG AAA. So it may be something that you do consider important, depending on your audience. Maybe something that you do want to include. But ideally, these should have more descriptive text. So you're all absolutely right. Ideally, it would be best to have more descriptive text. And additionally, this text describes an action which can only be performed using a mouse. So the words "click here," ideally it would be more descriptive, as you all mentioned. So we're going to have a final poll of, again, we don't have a priority for this issue. What priority do we think this issue should be? And again, high, medium, or low. So there's another note on this one, which is this issue has resulted from how the content has been written. I'll just give you a few more seconds. And I'll end the poll. So what priority do you think this issue should be? And the options are 21% of you said high, 42% of you said medium, and 37% of you said low. So personally, probably go for medium priority with this issue. But again, it does depend on the context. So if there was a really large number of all these click here links, it may be a high. But if it was only one link, for example, it could be considered a low as well. So this can be, you can think about change the priority depending on what's most appropriate. Oh, sorry, I didn't share those results. There we go. Those were the results of that poll. So we're now going to move on to think about what makes a good report. And I'll just quickly stop for any questions. I can see one's just come through. Since there are multiple links within that paragraph, does that not confuse readers trying to identify where a specific link will take them? That's a really good question. If we go back to the content. So I guess here that we have, yes, we do have a link, lots of links and lots of, it's all within the paragraph, but I guess strictly because it's within that paragraph, it would pass. And we do have that context. So for example, for a cheat sheet of accessibility issues, click here, that is providing that context. But it is, it would be best practice to have more descriptive links, and that would be much better. If this link was outside, so if I were to drag this down here, and that link is outside of that paragraph, that would fail because it doesn't have that context. So that's just an example of where we would raise an issue is if it wasn't within something contextual. But as I mentioned, it would fail the AAA requirement. So do bear that in mind as well. If I go back to the slides, I don't think we've got any more questions now, so I'll move on. So what makes a good report? So they're just going to quickly summarize some of the things to look for in a good report. So firstly, you want a clear indication of where to locate the issue within the code. So you don't just want to know that something didn't work. You want to know where it didn't work and what happened as well. You also want to provide support for remediating the issue, so aimed at the person responsible for resolving it. So think about who is likely to be fixing that issue. If we think about that additional issue we're just talking about with the links, that's going to be a content creator who is likely to be fixing that, in which case tailor the recommendation to them. The language one, that's likely to be a developer fixing that. So make the support relevant, and a developer might want code examples, while a content author might want links to documentation, for example, and guidelines on how to write those descriptive links, and maybe even training resources, for example. And also provide assistance with prioritising issues. So think about that context we talked about. So context does matter. What is the situation for that particular issue? And think about, what does the person getting the report need and what do they want to get out of the process? So it's important to make sure the person getting the report has everything they need. So accessibility reports are the first step in a process, and it shows the position at a point in time. So it's important to think about how you can take those learnings from that report and also then go and embed it within your process. Before I just move on to the next section, I can see there's two more questions about the links. So the first one is, how would you reword the "for a cheat sheet of accessibility issues, click here" link? That's a good question. So I guess it could be that you have the link as the cheat sheet of accessibility, for example, instead of having that click here, or it could be rephrasing the entire sentence, not just the link itself, and then putting the link somewhere else within the paragraph. And oh, thank you. There's some examples of potential below, so you can view our cheat sheet at any time, or a cheat sheet is available to all users, and link would be wrapped around the words cheat sheet. Thanks very much for that, both. So up until this point, we've talked about how to identify those issues, and but we want to finish off this webinar by talking about how we can stop them happening in the first place. So how can we make our audit reports easier by making sure that there are less issues being reported? So we need to think about engaging, embedding the accessibility across our organization and engaging the whole organization. So thinking about the senior management through to people creating the content and developers building the content. And this can be really difficult to do at an organizational level, and there is no magic wand. But we've got some suggestions over the next two slides of tools or models that you might want to think about, but it very much depends on your organization. So something you might want to think about is the design for all approach based on the EN 17161 design for all standard, which is a European standard. And it describes a four-step process. So it starts off by making sure you've got that commitment from leadership. So having those policies and objectives in place. And then the next step is planning for a wide range of users, planning for things like environmental factors, characteristics, planning them into your operations and your procurement process. And then looking at monitoring and measuring and evaluating the success, and then feeding this back into your policy and objectives. So the monitoring, measuring and evaluating step, often a lot of effort can go into the planning stage, but the monitoring step can be really important to help monitor the success and then help feed that back in to your policies and objectives. And procurement's also a really important area, because it's really important to procure those accessible systems, and leadership commitment is really critical as well to ensure that this whole cycle can work. And there are also some things you could do from the bottom up as well to embed and change the culture within your organization. So you could think about developing accessibility champions to lead peer-to-peer training. This could be, the BBC have a really good example, which they use it successfully to embed accessibility throughout the different departments. And this means that there can be more knowledge spread around the organization, and that there isn't necessarily one person where it's their sole job, but a lot of people have that knowledge. And you can also use the expertise you already have to understand and prioritize issues. So you might have existing disabled users, staff or internal disability groups, and formal user research to do diverse user testing. And this can be really valuable to get those insights and bring up issues that you might not find during auditing. And then also inclusive personas can be really useful, especially during the design stage. And this example, the link explains how they develop login examples based on different disabilities. So definitely worth having a look at when you get the slides. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. We've got some time for questions. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, then please pop them in the chat or the Q&A. So if anyone has any final questions they'd like to ask. Yeah, sorry, the one, thank you, John, about the ISL video. So what about Irish Sign Language videos for public body websites following ISL Act? This is something that we can follow up with in the follow-up and provide a resource for you. So we'll be able to get back to you when you get the slides. Brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone, for your comments in the chat. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. I'll just give another couple of seconds if anyone's got any final questions, and then I'll end today's session. No, it doesn't look like there's any more questions. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and I'm really glad you found it helpful. Brilliant. Thanks, everyone.